When I was at school, I wasn't taught anything about black soldiers in World War One.
Oh, for fuck's sake.
I had a faint idea that they might have been involved, but I didn't know the extent to which.
I definitely think awareness needs to be brought to it so that people can acknowledge that a lot of people from British colonies fought and gave their lives for the exact same thing that many British ancestors gave their life for.
Black subjects had their actions during the war written out of history.
No,
oh, fucking hell.
This is the story of whitewashing history, the old history you don't learn at school.
I think it's time to defund the BBC, don't you? I was on the fence there for a while because in the past they have served as a vessel for some of the best in British comedy, and I still think they employ a handful of decent journalists. But look, if they're determined to produce content indistinguishable from Vox.com, I'm out.
I'm out.
I'm not paying for that. I mean, have you taken a gander at BBC iPlayer recently? Go to the history section and see the sort of propaganda we as taxpayers are bankrolling. Britain's forgotten slave owners. Historian David Olusoga uncovers the untold story of Britain's slave owners. And there he is again, look. Separate programme. Alt history. Black British history we're not taught in schools. Scroll down. Black nurses. The women who saved the NHS. And... is this guy banging the Director General or something? Black and British. A forgotten history. David Olusoga explores the relationship between Britain and people of African origins, and it just goes on and on. And bear in mind, it's not as if British history was uneventful. I mean, July 4th has just been and gone. We might have enjoyed something on the American Revolution. It's over 200 years since the Slave Trade Act. You know, never mind Britain's forgotten slave owners. How about Britain's forgotten abolitionists with David Starkey? Right? That could have been a programme outside of the fact that it wouldn't fit the woke Black Lives Matter fuck whites narrative that the BBC is happy to promote. And now we have this, a rancid First World War presentation full of lies and race baiting that has sat on their website unopposed and unrebutted until now.
We're constantly reminded of the sacrifices of young British white men.
You liar!
I defy anyone to point me to a history book, either for academic or popular consumption, that racialises the sacrifices made during the First World War in that way. I challenge you to find a professor, a schoolmaster, a teacher, who, when describing the Battle of the Somme, for example, would say, major Allied offensive, July 1916, biggest battle on the Western Front, over 1 million men dead in just 4 months. Think of that. Oh, and most importantly, they were white men. So make a note of that, white men. It will be on the test. I'm willing to wager that hasn't happened even once. And yet, like I say, the BBC just allow that framing. No amendment, no pushback, no caption that comes up saying, there's not much evidence for this, we don't really teach history like that in this country. The idea of viewing the past through the prism of race is more a neo-Marxist import that liberal democracies don't really accept, as it tends to inflame unnecessary division as well as miss the point of key events. Well, that's a long caption, but you get the idea.
Yet more than 4 million non-European and non-white soldiers and auxiliaries participated in the war. This included 1.5 million from British India. more than 2 million from French colonies in Africa and Indochina, 400,000 African Americans, 100,000 Chinese laborers.
It's adorable that she thinks she's taught me something there. I mean, from the British angle, who doesn't know that Indian troops took part in both the First and Second World Wars? I mean, again, we don't make a song and dance of it. We don't frame things like, oh, here is the moment when the people of colour came to the aid of the whites. I mean, we don't talk like that. But anyone reasonably educated understands that it was a world war. And Britain had an empire. The French had an empire. The Germans had a couple of sausage factories in the Cameroon, I think, and that was about it. But anyway, it's not true that the contributions made by non-whites have been written out of history, and a cursory glance at a modern textbook will prove that. Conflict and Tension, First World War, 94 to 18, published 2 years ago by AQA, a popular British exam board for GCSE level history, which would be the final stage of compulsory education in the UK. I bought this book in preparation for this video, have read through it, and can confirm they don't obfuscate any of this stuff. They highlight the contribution of 15,000 Indian troops to the Gallipoli campaign, for example. There's a chapter on the Moroccan crisis, and crucially, there's a whole section titled The War in the Wider World. British and Indian troops fought the Turks in Mesopotamia. After a Turkish victory in April 1916, they were joined by Anzacs, and the Turks were forced back to the border. South Africans fighting for the British captured German Southwest Africa, now Namibia. The colony of German East Africa was successfully defended until the end of the war by 12,000 German and African troops, despite being under attack from 200,000 Allied troops. So, not only mentioned, but celebrated there, right? I mean, fighting to a stalemate when you're outnumbered 20 to 1 would have taken extraordinary courage and skill. Nobody's whitewashing anything, and this is required reading, remember, that students need to know these facts to pass the exam. Now, I bought this book for a couple of quid on Amazon. Are you telling me a BBC researcher couldn't have done that? They either couldn't be bothered to do their job and dig around a bit, or are so far down the rabbit hole they think information and propaganda are the same thing.
Find out like over 1 million people, like black people, contributed is crazy. Like even just last year we had the 100th anniversary of First World War I, and even then I didn't hear anything about it.
The people I always saw when we were talking about World War I or II were always just strangely very happy European people at the army front, looking like they're having a great time winning the war.
The attitude says so much, doesn't it? Winning the war? As if the fucking whites could have won anything without us? Oh, I sense resentment. I sense rage. I sense anti-white racism. The reason almost every soldier depicted in World War I is white is because almost every soldier in World War I was white. I mean, the number of 4 million non-white troops you mentioned earlier sounds impressive until you remember that over 70 million men fought in that war, putting the non-white participation rate at roughly 6%. A contribution, but let's not get carried away. The First World War took place largely in Europe and was fought largely by Europeans. And if you were in the terrible trade of teaching history purely through the lens of race, for every hour you spent discussing the non-white contribution, you would need to spend 18 discussing the white contribution.
Just strangely very happy European people at the army front, looking like they're having a great time winning the war, but nothing really engaging about the kind of rifts that may have happened between black and white soldiers and understanding how it actually was.
She wants to learn about the rifts that may have occurred between black and white soldiers. Well, of course she does. She's interested in causing rifts between blacks and whites today, so probably looking to pick up some pointers. Not only is that pathetic, it reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of what we are trying to achieve when teaching history to children. I mean, you are welcome to pursue that kind of specificity at the PhD level. Now, it's a thesis I would never read and regard as a complete waste of time, but you have that privilege. Students at the high school or secondary level, however, don't have time for that. I mean, they need to acquire a general picture of the First World War comprised of knowledge in key areas. How did it start? Who were the main players? Which were the main battles? And how were they fought? How did it end? And what were the consequences? If you know something about each of these questions, you are beginning to understand the event and its significance for the world, which is the entire point of the field. History is not there to serve as your personal vanity project. We are not going to sideline vital subjects and themes in order to focus on the black race and make insecure people feel better about themselves. That's just ridiculous. But I remember studying Chinese history with great passion many years ago, and you know what? Not once did I say to myself, well, this would be engaging if it weren't for all the fucking Chinese.
Fucking Chinese?
1919, Britain had won the war. A victory parade commenced through London. Despite more than 1 million black individuals fighting in the war, they cannot be seen taking part in the celebrations. Their participation has been largely ignored and overlooked.
I notice she's dropped the category of non-white now and wants to talk specifically about black soldiers, which is wise of her, because as anybody who knows something about the victory celebrations will be aware, there was a large Indian contingent. Not on the main day, unfortunately. They'd been invited, but couldn't make it in time. So instead, a separate parade was held exclusively for them a week later, which included a speech by King George, tea in Hampton Court, all the trimmings. And this was very much designed to honour the vital contribution India had made to the war. They had volunteered 1.5 million men. Now, you rather craftily claimed that 1 million black soldiers fought in World War I. I don't know where you're getting that number from. But if it was anything like that, they weren't fighting for the British. The bulk of that number would have been made up of African Americans who did receive a ceremony upon their return to New York, and French colonial troops. There was a West Indies regiment, of course, but we're talking about 15,000 men. Now, I don't want to be funny, but that many were getting killed a day by July of 1916, and that's not to belittle the individual sacrifices made, but in the grand scheme of things, you were extras. And extras don't always get invited to the premiere. Do you see what I'm saying?
Could you see me?
Yeah, definitely.
Excellent. We'll get out before that fat little extra gets his face in. Yep.
The army claimed they could not afford to transport foreign soldiers to London for the celebrations, but the reasons ran much deeper than this. Many within the ruling elite had big concerns about disturbing the racial hierarchy and damaging white supremacy.
This was the moment I knew for sure that the driving force behind this video was anti-white sentiment as opposed to being pro-black or in favour of a fresh perspective, because instead of using this time now to explore the contributions she describes as having been whitewashed, right? Instead of sharing a story about a black soldier who did something particularly heroic, she is going to use the rest of the presentation to bitch about white people. And that is very revealing. They don't care about black history, okay? Aside from the extent to which they can use the idea that they do as a club to beat us with. And also, notice how the goalposts have moved. They started the video criticizing the way history is taught today. They made a bunch of assertions, each of which I buried under a mountain of logic, and now she wants to get in a time machine, go back 100 years, and use any racism she may find there as ammunition in her war against British society in 2020. I mean, that's not only bad form, it's mental.
This was the era of the British Empire, and people believed in racial theories. One of the most popular argued that different races were competing for survival. In their minds, it was the survival of the fittest. In India, the British favoured martial races. They stereotyped ethnic groups. Some were seen as effeminate. Sikhs were seen as the perfect martial people, tall and strong and physically imposing. They were seen as worthy to partake in the Victory March of July 1919. They were viewed as a race with a higher status than African or Caribbean troops.
Yeah, if you're expecting me to apologise for my ancestors favouring warrior cultures during a time of war, you can go fish, because that ain't gonna happen. It's true, the Sikhs were well respected, but Indians of all stripes were acknowledged during and after the war. And if you want evidence of that, go and visit the Royal Pavilion, George IV's Summer Palace, which was transformed into a hospital in 1914 to care exclusively for Indian soldiers wounded on the Western Front. Great efforts were made to cater for all manner of dietary and religious requirements. Those who died were cremated in accordance with their spiritual beliefs, and a memorial called the Chhatri was unveiled in 1921 to remember all of the Indians who fought for the British Army.
It's just a habit to completely erase who is being exploited. There's this entire kind of network of support that the West kind of leaned on and exploited.
When I was younger, I always used to wonder, why is it called World War if you can't see any element of world and the diversity that's in the world?
Well, on that technical point, I sort of agree with you. It should be called the Great War, really, as it once was, but then again, it is in many ways the first half of the Second World War, so things get complicated. But as for exploitation, nobody was exploited. I mean, can we just leave the Marxist mumbo-jumbo at the door, please? They were all volunteers, for a start, and nobody is being erased. You might like to visit the memorial gates at Hyde Park, for example, which were erected, as the inscription reads, in memory of the 5 million volunteers from the Indian subcontinent, Africa and the Caribbean who fought with Britain in the 2 world wars. Have you been to the Imperial War Museum, where they host entire collections of West Indies memorabilia, including uniforms, photographs and films? They just unveiled, a few years ago, an African and Caribbean war memorial in Windrush Square, Brixton. The trouble is, you don't know anything. And that's what's actually being revealed throughout this project. What irritates me is the BBC keeping you ignorant, so they can channel your misplaced moral outrage for their own ends. It's really disgusting.
Negative stereotyping was rife on both sides of the war. These ideas were not restricted to Britain. The same ethnic stereotyping was taking place in Germany too. But there, few people had ever met a black soldier. Instead, racism was used to attack black soldiers in the British or French armies. A pamphlet was published called...
Oh, look at that face. She's so proud of herself. She's found the smoking gun, everybody. A racist pamphlet that's a century old. Well done. Wow, this is like Christmas for you, isn't it? Go on then, open your prezi.
The employment, contrary to international law, of coloured troops upon the European theatre of war by England and France. The pamphlet suggested colonial soldiers conducted terrible acts of brutality, including cutting body parts off of German soldiers. Coloured troops carried war trophies, the severed heads and fingers of German soldiers, wore ears which they have cut off as ornaments about their necks.
So the whinge here appears to be that propaganda was an instrument of war. Is anyone surprised by that? Do you mean to tell me that the Germans wanted to win and tried to motivate their own side by demonizing the other? This is brand new information. Now show us the anti-British cartoons the Kaiser had commissioned, okay? Oh, you're not going to do that? Would spoil the narrative? I'll do it then. Here's a fairly famous one. The British are depicted as a giant spider spreading their web over Europe while the German eagle stands guard. Now, that's not very nice, is it? I'm British. Does anyone have some pearls for me to clutch? Other posters painted us as demons or as a fat bloke there, look. It's a bit rich coming from the Jerrys, I gotta say. But we were all doing it. I mean, what do you think war is? You think the gloves are on? Please, grow up. This is not serious. Word of advice. When someone makes a claim within a conflict where civilizations are at stake, be skeptical.
Look what I got for you, sir. What? It's the latest issue of King and Country. Oh, damn inspiring stuff. The magazine that tells the Tommies the truth about the war.
Or alternatively, the greatest work of fiction since Vows of Fidelity were included in the French marriage service.
Come, sir. Now, you can't deny that this fine newspaper is good for the morale of the men.
Certainly not. I just think that more could be achieved by giving them some real toilet paper.
Not with you at all, sir. What could any patriotic chap have against this magnificent mag?
Apart from his bottom?
Black soldiers and sailors had contributed to the war. They had given their lives to fight for Crown, country and the Commonwealth. That didn't fit the image imperialists had for them.
In school, the world wars are probably the most taught things in history. When I think world wars, I just think Europe and America and maybe Russia. But it's crazy to think that so many people contributed and their contributions never been acknowledged.
History needs to be more accurately rewritten.
History needs to be more accurately rewritten.
No, you need to be fired out of a cannon. The fact that the BBC has facilitated this hokum has made me genuinely angry. The central theme throughout that, and this was summed up by the one in the cap at the end there, is that black soldiers have never been acknowledged for the contributions they made to the war effort, and this is a public lie. It is demonstrably untrue. We've literally built monuments to these people, and yet this presenter conceals all of the facts that I brought to bear, brainwashes a bunch of kids on my dime, lies to them, stands in front of the camera, says 2 + 2 equals fuck whites, and the BBC sign off on it. Not good enough. Okay, I fully support the movement to defund these suckers. I'm sick of paying for it. I'm sick of tipping my own executioner. And not only should they have their funding pulled, they should be forced to change their name. Otherwise, I'm going to sue them under the Trade Descriptions Act, because they may be a corporation, they may broadcast, but In what sense are they British? Any ideas? Didn't think so. Their office is here. That's all I've got. Salut, pip pip, toodaloo. Bye-bye then.
Permission to ask a question, sir?
Permission granted, Baldrick, as long as it isn't the one about where babies come from.
No. The thing is, the way I see it, these days there's a war on, right? And ages ago there wasn't a war on, right? So there must have been a moment when there not being a war on went away, right? And there being a war on came along. So what I want to know is, how did we get from the one case of affairs to the other case of affairs?
Do you mean, how did the war start?
Yeah.
The war started because of the vile Hun and his villainous empire building.
George, the British Empire at present covers a quarter of the globe, while the German Empire consists of a small sausage factory in Tanganyika. I hardly think that we can be entirely absolved from blame on the imperialistic front.
Oh, no. No, sir. Absolutely not. Mad as a bicycle.
I heard that it started when a bloke called Archie Duke shot an ostrich because he was hungry.
I think you mean it started when the Archduke of Austro-Hungary got shot.
No, there was definitely an ostrich involved, sir.
Well, possibly. But the real reason for the whole thing was that it was just too much effort not to have a war.
By gum, this is interesting. I always loved history. The Battle of Hastings, Henry VIII and his 6 knives, all that.
You see, Baldrick, in order to prevent war in Europe, 2 superblocks developed. Us, the French and the Russians on one side, and the Germans and Austro-Hungary on the other. The idea was to have 2 vast opposing armies, each acting as the other's deterrent. That way, there could never be a war.
But this is a sort of a war, isn't it, sir?
Yes, that's right. You see, there was a tiny flaw in the plan.
What was that, sir?
It was bollocks.
So the poor old ostrich died for nothing.